Hey listeners, welcome to COMM-versations, the show where we sit down and have a conversation with one of faculty members that makes up the communication department here at Augusta University. Our goal is to help you get to know some of these amazing people and make your education a little easier. Today we're here with Dr. Bulla. He's the chair of the communication department, and we're just going to be asking him a few questions. So we just want to start out with you telling us a little bit about yourself.
My name's David Bulla. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina, which is about 4.5 hours from Augusta. I grew up there, went to Grimsley High School, which has a very interesting nickname, the Whirlies, which means basically the cyclones or tornadoes. We were terrible in football back then. Math teacher coached the football team. We were terrible. Basketball team was great. Went to the state championship game the year after I graduated. Now they're great in football. It's still pretty good in basketball, but it is basketball country because of the ACC. Grimsley was a really good academic school. It's an IB school now, like Lakeside. I then went to UNC Greensboro, where I majored in English because I was already working for a commercial newspaper, the Greensboro News and Record. I had worked for our high school newspaper, which was called High Life, because there were a lot of drugs sold at my high school.
Okay.
On the front lawn by doctors' sons. So it's really
High Life.
Yeah, really interesting. This is in the 1970s.
Was this known by the faculty?
I think a few faculty probably bought every now and then.
Oh,
Wow.
okay.
Especially pot, I would think. The harder stuff, maybe not.
I feel like this should be turned into a TV show.
Yeah, well, and then I had a classmate. He was a wonderful guy, but he was a real comedian, and he routinely had vodka in his locker, and would come to class drunk. So it was an interesting place.
That's so interesting.
The
What?
UNCG had been an all-women's school for most of its history, and in the early 1960s they had merged and made it co-ed. And my mom actually went there, and then she worked there she was working in the grad school when I was there. And a couple of my best friends from high school were going there. I applied to Chapel Hill, the journalism school. I was given that, what do they call it, delayed or deferred?
Oh, yeah.
And I'm like, no, I'm not going to sit out a semester. And they wanted me to go to Orange County Community College, I believe, in Hillsborough, North Carolina. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do that. I had a close friend who did do that, but he was going to major in business at Chapel Hill. So I majored in English and had minors in history and religious studies. Mainly, I just read a lot, and I had some great teachers, but I worked almost full-time at the Greensboro News and Record, first in news and then in sports. And that's really why I am where I am today. The guy who got me involved in it was named Erwin Smallwood. He died last year. He's 98 years old. He lived an unbelievable life. He was on my paper route. He was good friends with my father. He was at our church. He sang in the choir, and his daughter will tell you he fell asleep every week because he had been working Saturday night at the newspaper. And every now and then the minister would wake him up. And UNCG was a really cool school. In the 70s, it was very hippie-ish, sort of. About 10 years after that, it all happened at big schools, like Berkeley and Wisconsin and Columbia. And then I was in the newspaper business for 10 years as a sports writer, sports editor. I worked in 3 cities, Greensboro, Winston-Salem, and Durham, all in North Carolina, basically covering the same thing. A lot of high school sports, some minor league baseball. I covered the Durham Bulls the year before they made the movie Bull Durham. I was an idiot. I left just before they started making it. And a lot of ACC basketball, especially Michael Jordan. And I know that you want to tell the Michael Jordan story, which I will.
We will get to that.
Yeah, we'll get to that. But, and then I worked, then I decided I wanted to be a teacher. My mom had been telling me all along, you need to get your certificate. You majored in English. You're not going to be a journalist all your life. So I went and got my certificate to teach in North Carolina. I taught for 10 years, 9 years in high school, 1 year in middle school. Middle school was quite the trip. Those kids are they have too much energy.
Rambunctious.
And they were great kids, but they were just, it wasn't quite right for me. They weren't quite maybe mature enough, but I still learned a lot from them. So, and then I started talking to some people in Chapel Hill at the journalism school about getting a master's. I took a couple of classes, and then they said, well, you really need to do this full time, stop teaching. So I actually ended up just applying to Indiana University and got in the summer, and I told them, I said, I can't come in August. It was like literally I applied in July And by August 1st, they said, you can come. And I said, I can't come. I don't have enough money. So I worked one more semester, tried to save every dollar. And then I moved up to Bloomington, which is where I met my wife, Kalpana Ramgopal. She was an Indian journalist who wanted to do a master's degree in journalism. She got, listen to where she got into. Her brother, who's an engineer, went to Oklahoma State and lives in Atlanta, hooked her up with Georgia Tech. He knew the two of them, NYU, Indiana, and one other. And NYU is where she really wanted to go, but they didn't offer any money. So she came to IU, and she's the hardest working person I've ever met in my life. She worked 4 jobs the entire time we were there.
Oh my
at IU.
gosh.
Wow.
And I worked none. I borrowed money from President Clinton and President Bush, and the rest is history. And then she got a job, at a newspaper in Fort Wayne, Indiana. I decided to go to Florida to get my PhD. She then moved down to Lakeland, Florida. She worked at a newspaper owned by the New York Times, a great newspaper in Lakeland, Florida.
My family's from Lakeland.
They changed the design of the paper every single day.
Oh my gosh.
Who ran the graphic design, page design, was really an artist. And, all these people they're all out of the industry now. I don't even know if, New York Times does not own the Lakeland Ledger anymore. It was a great newspaper. And what was cool was at the journalism school at Florida, where I was getting my PhD in mass communication, there were people on their advisory council who were part of the Lakeland Ledger. In fact, the editor-in-chief was. And so he came up all the time. And so I had a good relationship with them. My last year, I did teach at Florida. I always taught 2 classes, but I lived 4 out of the 7 days a week in Lakeland. Did most of my studying at Florida Southern College, not at UF. Florida Southern is this really small school that we played basketball. They kicked our butts back in early in the season.
I remember that.
And they're pretty good in athletics, but their buildings were built by Frank Lloyd Wright, the great architect. So I'm sitting in these Frank Lloyd Wright buildings and working on my dissertation, so I kind of felt lucky. Finished. And then started my career at Iowa State University in Ames, worked there for 7 years, got tenure, got promoted to associate professor, and then decided to kind of, try something different. And my wife, Kalpana's mom and dad live in Sharjah, which is one of the United Arab Emirates, and it's right next to the Dubai airport. And what happened is both of her grandmothers literally died like back to back, and they're in India. And in Hinduism, you have 48 hours to cremate the body. And we couldn't get Kalpana to either memorial service before that was done. Her brother did make one of them from Atlanta, because he was in Atlanta. He could get on a plane really quickly to get it's 10,000 miles away, 10 and a half hours. So we decided her grandfather was the only one left, and she was really close to him. We said, we got to be near when he goes. So here's the interesting story. We're in Abu Dhabi, the United Arab Emirates, at Zayed University for 6 years. The last thing we do before we come back to the United States is we go visit him in Bangalore, India. He's 96 or 7. But he had been an invalid for a long time. He had actually fallen down some stairs and broken his spine. And he's still alive when we leave. And, of course, he dies like a year later. So all that kind of got thrown out. But she did get to go to his service. But living abroad was a fantastic experience. Every single student at AU, if they can afford it, should try to study abroad, because you cannot really understand who you are as an American until you see the rest of the world. And also, you can't understand the world. We as Americans are, we're on this continent that, the only other continent close to us is South America, really. Europe, Africa, Asia, and of course Antarctica are way far away. And we live in this little English-speaking bubble, mostly, majority Christian, a lot of things. And that's not the only soup out there. And my students in the UAE, or I'll put it this way, my oldest son, Bulla, he was at American Community School, which was for the American Embassy brats, kids, and anybody else who wanted to go there. There were about 56 languages spoken at that school.
Wow.
And we get all offended about, Spanish, maybe French, maybe Mandarin or German. I'm like, and of course in Europe, everybody, we're going to France and the Netherlands this summer, and everybody speaks English, but then you can turn on the other language when they don't want you to hear whatever snide things they're going to say about Americans. But it was the greatest experience of my life. And I hope my oldest son, Viraj, feels the same way. My youngest son was only born 6 months before we left, so he doesn't even remember it. And that's too bad because it was a great experience for Viraj. But and I do miss it, especially the food. It's a big city, and it's big. It's bigger than Atlanta. So, but it's an interesting country. It's an interesting part of the world, and the opportunity to travel anytime we wanted to Asia or Africa or Europe was kind of cool. Because here, we do go. We do go to Europe a lot, especially England. And England's cool, but getting to go. We went to Berlin, we went to Vienna, we went to Athens. Didn't go to Rome, but went to Venice, Milan, Florence, Barcelona, Madrid, Valencia. My son and I went to South Africa one summer. I was writing a book about Gandhi. Stayed in a home that he lived in for a while.
Wow.
A couple of nights, and it was winter. It was cold. But you could drive 3 hours away and you'd be in the tropical area of South Africa. So one of the coolest places I've ever been. Went to the Seychelles just before my youngest son was born. So I feel really fortunate to have done that. But, and we still travel a little bit, but still it's so different in the United States. Nobody wants to, and I'll fully admit that when I came back, when the national anthem was played, I'd cry. I still occasionally cry because it's. I feel it's the greatest country in the world, but we do have our flaws. Every place has its flaws, but I think it's one of the greatest educations you can get is to kind of get outside of yourself, being a minority. First time in my life as a minority, I got pulled by the secret police a few times doing nothing. I got pulled one time by them for going too slow on a street. Why are you going so slow, sir? I said, well, I had my dogs in the back. I'm like. My son was, just 3 or 4 years old at the time. So, but it's great education.
Is there a country that you would recommend students go to, as their first foreign, travel?
For Americans, if you want to do it sort of the easiest way, you probably want to go to the UK first, just to get,
dip your toes in it. Yeah.
Especially if you hadn't had a passport, you get that passport, it's the first place to go. I actually went to Canada first, but I think that's cheating.
Cheating.
My sister,
I want to go to Canada.
Who majored in Spanish, among other things, went to Mexico and Spain. My favorite country in the world is actually Greece.
That makes sense.
Especially Crete. Crete is this island that has this beautiful Mediterranean beaches, and then it has mountains in the middle that are, 10, 12,000. They're snow-capped most of the year, and they're pretty close. So it's kind of like Hawaii, But Hawaii mountains are volcanic, so they don't have snow on top. I do think that the trip to Pretoria, Johannesburg, and then eastern South Africa, Kruger Park, was probably the most sobering. And the most illuminating when it was over. My driver, we hired. That's what they call renting a driver. You rent a driver in his car for X amount of time. All done by friends of mine. I didn't have anything to do with who we got. This driver took us to Soweto, where there's this township with several million poor black people living in it. And under apartheid, they had protested and been massacred, and they took me to this church, Viraj and I, to a church where Desmond Tutu preached all the time, even though he was he was Anglican, and this was a Catholic church. I think it was called St. Mary's. And they would show me where the bullets. This is a church, and the Afrikaner police had shot into this church after young black teenage boys who were breaking curfew. And it made me have to reckon with who I was as a Southerner. I grew up the first 10 years or 12 years of my life were segregated. I would go to my downtown theater in downtown Greensboro called the Carolina Theater. Whites would sit in the bottom, blacks would sit in the top. I had no idea what was going on. I'm just watching Chitty Chitty Bang Bang and Mary Poppins. I had no idea why this is happening. And they didn't come down and we didn't go up. And in 1972, our junior high school, which is what they called middle school back then, was integrated. And I was in a school that remained hugely majority white. but about 25% of the students were black. And they were great kids, and I was in band with them and PE and on the basketball team and all that. But that was it. And Greensboro was a very divided city, a lot like Augusta or Richmond, Columbia County, maybe a better way to look at it now. African Americans lived mainly in the southeastern part of Greensboro, and the other 3 quadrants were mainly white. When I was coming back on the plane, Viraj and I are flying back on Etihad, which is the National Airlines of Abu Dhabi, straight down south, 1,000 miles exactly. We're flying back, and I just happened to be listening to a Bruce Springsteen song because I like the boss. He was my childhood hero, I guess you could say. And it's a song about the murder of I believe he was Haitian, African-American Haitian fella in New York. And he actually wasn't guilty of the crime he was the wrong man. And the New York cops shot him 41 times? Yeah, it's called 41 shots. And I'm listening to this song and I'm like, you know what, David? You spent your entire life living in a dream world. And so the combination of sort of seeing Soweto, seeing where Mandela's wife, Winnie, lived. She lived in a house that was about as big as this room.
Wow.
While he was in prison for 27 years, near Cape Town, and basically this island that was awful. It was like Tasmania. And then meanwhile, having been in the UAE and suddenly for the first time, not being the white male who kind of, in the U.S. is kind of in charge of everything, and have preferences and all this. It just, I'm like, oh, you got to realize you've been really lucky. I'd always called my students in the UAE incredibly lucky because why did the British, they were idiots. Why did they give these oil countries back like the UAE? Because if they kept it, they'd have more oil than we would, and we have a lot. The U.S. has a lot. But in the 60s, Britain decided to sort of get rid of they got rid of their empire essentially. And so these kids that I was teaching, and they weren't kids, they were young women mainly and some young men, they lived in this incredibly influenced society. You can't even imagine it. When I'd be in the bank, I'd look at how many zeros were next to that paycheck. With the first digit would be a 2, 3, 4, 5, and then there'd be this was a 1 month salary, and they were having oil earnings is what it was.
Yeah.
And so it's a country of about 900,000 Emiratis. They're all wealthy.
Wow.
Because the sheikh makes sure they're all wealthy, and he should.
I didn't know that.
And so you're like, oh, they're so spoiled, They didn't ask for it. It just happened. The British gave it back to them, and it was theirs. It was their land.
Yeah.
And they deserved it. I wish they'd shared a little more. And they actually are the UAE is incredibly generous. But when I say share it, I mean share it with the people who work for them, because 90% of the population there is not Emirati.
Oh, okay.
But it sort of wakes you up to how American history is this complicated thing, especially in the South because of slavery. Now, remember, the whole East Coast had slavery until some of these northeastern states slowly got out of it.
Right.
A lot of people conveniently forget that it's not just the South that had it. But the legacies of slavery are, and then segregation, which we, of course, had in Georgia and in Augusta, are raw and are awful and are very difficult problems to solve that have not completely been solved. But things are definitely way better than when I was in that theater in Greensboro and looking up and, Dad, what are those kids doing up there? Why, that's not there anymore. Yeah. Thank God. So things are, and so that's why I say when I came back, I'm like, I'm still really happy to be an American. It's not easy always being an American. I'm a little weary this summer going to Europe, and people are going to be anti-American. In some places. You get to the bottom line. We're still really fortunate to be where we are. And we're really fortunate to be in Augusta. I think Augusta University and Augusta are
Augusta's great, yeah.
It's got a lot of things going for it.
Yeah, that's interesting to hear from someone who's been seemingly everywhere.
Well, it's not. Somebody said that the other day. I'm like, no, not really. I had a colleague. She's Canadian. She lives in Vancouver. She was single, so she taught in what was called the College of what was it called? Something college. I forgot. It was kind of a British college, so it didn't really have a subject. Anyway, so they really were teaching like writing a lot in that college, but it wasn't the English department. Every single time we had a holiday, our long weekend, she went somewhere. So she had been to like 60 countries in like 5 years.
That's crazy.
We thought we went to a lot, but that you had that ability because both Abu Dhabi and Dubai have these incredible airports, two wonderful airlines, and every other airline flies into there too. So that's a great thing about another reason I think about for people to live abroad or work abroad a little bit is you probably will be in a place where you're going to be able to travel. Like if you're in Europe, you can get on a train and go anywhere. And I think that's a great it's a great experience, lifetime experience.
So we have a question for you. What have been some highlights in your career so far? Or if you have like one singular highlight?
You mean other than the Jordan story?
Hey, you can tell that if you want.
Jordan story.
Well, I'll just tell that story real quick. Because it really, for as a journalist, is the best thing.
It's
that ever
such a cool story.
So I think it was the same summer my father died, which was 1986. I think it was 86. I have the article back in my office because they digitized the newspapers in North Carolina. So I'm working on a Sunday afternoon when I should have been off in my office in Winston-Salem, North Carolina at the Winston-Salem Chronicle. And my colleague, who's a news reporter, calls me. He says, "Hey, Bulla, Jordan's at Winston-Salem State playing." I said, What do you mean? Michael Jordan. He had just been Rookie of the Year, so I think 86 is right for the Bulls, for Chicago Bulls. He's over here playing. And I said, "Well, why are you there?" He says, "Well, he had this food truck and he sold food on the weekends at parks around town." And so I said, "All right, I'll get there." And I had to call my photographer because my photographer had gone to Chapel Hill, which is where Jordan played at UNC Chapel Hill for the Tar Heels. And I said, "JP, let's meet over there in about 25 minutes. So we get there, and what it is they had an NBA, and I put that in quotes, an NBA professional league. So guys who had played in the NBA and now just had retired to Winston-Salem, and there were several of them, and guys who had played in the ACC or equivalent colleges and were now in the NBA or about to go to the NBA, played in this league, and we covered it. I don't know why we weren't covering it that particular weekend. Maybe I'd actually sent my intern there, but I can't remember. Anyway, so JP and I get there, and I start writing everything down. He starts taking pictures, and the final score was unbelievable. It was like 157 to 134, and Jordan's team won. And he had I used to say he had 100. I looked it up. I think he had like 55 or 60 points anyway. And he was a fantastic. I mean, this was like the year before his second year, and they hadn't quite gotten to the point where they had Scottie Pippen and Robin and all that when they were dominant. Anyway, so when it's over, Big House Gaines is the coach at Winston-Salem State. He gets me and Michael, and I'm like, I can't interview him here. It's gonna, there were like 1,000 people, mostly girls, mostly young women, who were all trying to get his phone number. That's really what was going on. Although, there were no cell phones then. This is 1986. Yeah. So I don't know what they were trying to do. And so Coach Gaines said, "Well, let's do this." So we start walking toward his office, but you had to get into an elevator to go up to his office, which was on the second floor of the gym. And we get in it, and he just turns the elevator off. He says, "All right, you got 15 minutes." So I interviewed Michael Jordan for 15 minutes. And then, of course, I wrote a terrible story because I decided to compare him to Ralph Sampson, who had played at Virginia. Sampson had been 3-time Player of the Year, and then Jordan was the Player of the Year 1 year after Sampson had graduated. And I was like, Jordan's great, but Sampson's better. And it was stupid. I mean, it's like the same kind of mistake the coach who cut Jordan at Laney High School in Wilmington when he's a sophomore. I got it all wrong. But Jordan was great. I mean, he gave me all the time I wanted. But Big House was a savior. And Big House was literally a big man. He coached at Winston-Salem State. He won a national championship with a guy named Earl Monroe. And he was probably about 6'7". He probably weighed 300 pounds.
Oh, my gosh.
He's the nicest guy you've ever met. He was like, every time I covered him, win, lose, or draw, he's a little like Dip. He would give you any kind of quote you needed. So It was really the highlight of my career. I mean, I've been to national championship games, but getting to interview Michael Jordan. And I interviewed him a couple other times in exhibition games when he's with the Bulls, but there was nothing as cool as this. And he's sweating, and he's not even really, wearing a uniform or anything. And but he was really super nice, and Big House was the star that day. We were just really fortunate.
You work pretty closely with the newspaper industry, which I feel like is evolving in a pretty dramatic way right now. How do you see it adapting, or do you see it adapting?
I don't think it adapted when it needed to. I think it needed to adapt about 20, 25 years ago when the internet was really starting to take off. Let me tell you this. The truth of the matter is I decided to go back to get my master's because the internet had come along, and I thought, oh, this is going to be a shot in the arm to journalism in the United States. It happened briefly. But overall, for print journalism, it's gone downhill. Now, TV news sort of survived the worst of it. But even if you ask the people at JBF and RDW, they'll tell you they have nothing like the operations they had 25 or 30 years ago. That is not to say that journalism's disappeared. It's still there. And it does face some challenges other than the new platforms, the smartphone and the internet. But it's really hard. When I was starting out in the 70s, Watergate had happened in 72 to 74. Everybody wanted to be a journalist. I didn't want to be a journalist because of that. I don't want to be a journalist because I like telling stories and I like writing. And I don't know why. I mean, I majored in English. I'm not quite sure why I leaned to journalism and not maybe writing novels or short stories or plays or something, or scripts for TV, which would have made a lot of sense because I would have made a lot more money. But I think that there's a pivotal point right now for journalism in the United States. However, I will say this. There are a lot of places in the world right now where journalism is better than it's ever been. My wife is from India. They have 40,000 newspapers.
Wow.
We don't even have 2,000 anymore. So
what's the difference?
they love print. We don't.
So it's just the passion for it.
Yeah, I think a passion for it, and then the technology has not quite caught up yet. Although it depends on where you are. If you're in Bollywood, yeah, it's caught up. But if you're in a small town, and most of India's small towns, villages really, the main media are newspapers and radio. So that's where we were a long time ago. So that's one thing to keep in mind. And also, I mean, having lived in Abu Dhabi has a CNN headquarters there. The headquarters are in Atlanta, New York, Washington, London, Hong Kong, and Abu Dhabi. We could have sent an unlimited number of students to work for CNN. Unfortunately, most of my students did not really want to. They wanted to go into journalism. Their parents didn't want them to go into journalism because women are not supposed to be very publicly oriented in the UAE and in the Middle East in general. But we had no trouble getting them internships there. And I had one student who was actually born in Atlanta. She was Emirati. She was born in Atlanta. So technically she's an American too. She worked for CNN for a while. She was really good at it. They loved her because she could speak Arabic and they couldn't.
Oh, yeah.
So she could go interview ordinary Abu Dhabians or Emiratis, and she'd get the scoop. And they were like, we didn't know that was going on. So that was kind of cool. But I would not discourage anybody from going into journalism now in the United States, but I think you better know what you're getting into. And there are other ways to do something very similar. Most people who go into journalism here in Augusta, and there are a lot of people because you still have a little shell of a paper in the Chronicle. You have the Augusta Press and Augusta Good News, but you still have these 3 TV stations. Most of those people stay in it for a while, and then they come and work for Augusta University as PR people. They're jobs, and I don't blame them. The people who work in this particular building are that way. So, but there's nothing wrong with that. You're still telling stories, and you learn a lot from journalism about how to collect information and how to be professional and ethical.
Yeah.
One of the segments that we've been hitting is I have a printed out Rate My Professor review.
Yeah.
And I would like you to read it out loud and then tell me a bit about it.
Okay. Let's see.
When's it from?
I don't remember.
Let's see.
It's from a bit ago.
No.
This was from Iowa State, I think. He can get windy, and I find myself not paying attention. My wife would agree with this. Because I've lost interest. He knows what he's talking about. It's sometimes he drags out a topic way too long overall. He's a great professor when he talks. Yeah, I think I know who wrote that.
Really?
Yes. He lives in Iowa. He's a good guy too. He's one of my best students. I think he wrote that. I think he wrote it. I think it was kind of like something you did on a Friday night, having a few beers. But no, that's pretty accurate. My wife would totally agree with that. Don't talk so much. Let them talk.
Do you feel like you've done that?
Of course. She's the same way, by the way. She can out-talk me any day. So. But
I mean, that's a good quality in a faculty member.
Well, it is, but it's also a good quality, I think, in a journalist, and it's. But you got to be a good listener too.
Yeah.
But we are about public speaking, and I try to. I think Dr. Hayward does it, and Dr. Johnson, Dr. Carrie Reif-Stice. We try to model what we think is good, professional communication.
Oh yeah, definitely.
Yeah. No, that's fair. I don't have any problem with that. If it's accurate, I'm fine with it.
Fair enough. I feel like this series was birthed from the idea that Rate My Professor is an inaccurate way to judge faculty members. And I'm learning as we go that that's both true and untrue, because I think they hit some of the correct points, but the overall sentiment is skewed based off of you have to feel very passionately to write a review in the first place.
Yeah. No, I agree. And there's a lot to be said for public forums where you can actually do that. I know who wrote that. So in a way, he didn't get away with it. But anonymity can maybe be a good thing because people will open up. They don't feel like they're going to be targeted or something. So not that I pay too much attention to that kind of stuff, but there's nothing wrong with being criticized if you can learn from your criticism.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so this is probably going to be our last question. But what is your guilty pleasure outside of your career? Do you have any hobbies or interests?
Other than donuts? Two of our faculty members who are in a relationship just had a baby last week, and the baby brought us 24 donuts the other day.
Oh, that's nice.
4 of them tonight, and I think I ate 3 yesterday, and maybe 1 this morning. I'm like, and listen, I consider myself a donut expert. I hate to break it to people, but Krispy Kreme is not donuts. It's fried lard with sugar on top of it. Dunkin's a little closer. Depends on which kind of Dunkin' donut you get. Don't go there. That's my guilty pleasure. Really, ultimately, it's reading. If you came and looked at our bedrooms, office, den, living room, there are books everywhere. My wife wishes I'd throw them all away, except the few that we sort of read in common. And she reads a lot too, is in a book club. But, right now if I go in right now, I have 1 book I'm reading, and with it, I have my ultimate iPad, which I bought the first year iPads came out, which is now 20.
Oh my gosh.
Almost 20 years ago. If it ever falls apart, it won't be fixed. There's nothing to fix.
Yeah.
I can't even find a decent cord to replace the.
But it still runs?
But it still runs. Yeah. Anyway. And what's interesting is I'm not reading the exact same book, but I'm reading a companion book on that. And I read that one when I need to be in the dark, when everybody else is asleep.
Yeah.
So, but then next to my bed, I actually cleaned it up recently. I think there's 3 books. Normally there's about 10.
Wow.
My oldest son sort of recently, he got sick, he had the flu, and he sort of took over a room I had been sort of reading in a lot, and I had 20 books there. So, and the main guilty pleasure within the reading, I'll read a lot of nonfiction because I'm a historian of the mass media, but my main guilty pleasure is reading what are called procedural novels, which are mystery crime novels of essentially 4 writers. Anne Cleves, who writes about a guy named Jimmy Perez, who lives on an island called Shetland. She retired it, but several years ago, 2021, she's bringing him back this fall. And now he's got his second wife. The first one got murdered, unfortunately. It broke my heart. It was hard to read after that because I'm like, you can't kill off this woman. And so he's got his new wife, and she's also she's a detective, and they live in the Orkney Islands. So the woman's moving from Shetland to Orkney, which is these islands off Scotland. My first love was Colin Dexter. My youngest son, his middle name is named after him, Colin Dexter, who was British. He lived in Oxford, and he wrote about 2 guys named Morse and Lewis. Inspector Morse was this brilliant Oxford educated, but he fell out. He dropped out when he was a classic studier, student. And that series went on. I think there were 16 novels, and then the BBC, not BBC, I think it was Granada Television, made it into a series. I think there's 34 episodes. And then I'm leaving out 2. Ian Rankin, who's still alive. He lives in Edinburgh. He writes a about a guy named Rebus. Now Rebus is retired. He actually is in jail right now. And the next novel I think is going to get out. Looked like that was the foreshadowing. And then the last one is Wallander by Henning Mankell, who died a few years ago. He's another guy who liked Crete. He loved the capital of Crete, Heraklion. And Wallander is Swedish, and he lives in a town in the southern part of Sweden, not too far from Denmark. And he solves a series of brutal crimes. He's the most haunting. He's the most intellectual. He's also the most anti-American, I would say, of the three. But I literally cannot live without these people. And I've read all of them.
Yeah.
And the Rankin ones, there's somewhere in the 30s, because he literally has a contract to write one every year. I don't know how he does it. He goes to somewhere in Africa, I think, to write them, or Portugal maybe. And I think he's not. Well, I know the Perez one's coming out this year. That's the only one I'm anticipating. I think it's coming out in September, October. They keep asking me to go ahead and buy it pre-sales on Amazon. I'm not going to do that. But those are my guilty pleasures. I will say that before that, my guilty pleasure was watching a show called Homicide by David Simon. Barry Levinson was the executive producer. He's the guy who gave us Rain Man. And it was about Baltimore police homicide detectives. And it was a show on TV in the 1990s, but it's based on a book. I used to teach at Iowa State. It may have been that class, by the way. And I was a windbag in that class. I'll admit. Besides David Simon. And Homicide was just an incredible TV series. Starring a guy named Andre Brower, who died 2 years ago. Brower was a great actor. I think he was from Chicago. And he played a guy named Frank Pimbleton, which is not the real detective. The real detective's name was Edgerton. But he was a New York cop, a New Yorker working with the Baltimore cops. He was aloof. Pimbleton was just as aloof as the real Edgerton. And it was about a year in Baltimore where typically they have 300 or 400 murders, and they're trying to solve all these murders. And it's crazy. It shows you the inside of a city. You know, Augusta the last few years we don't have 300 or 400 murders, but we've had a much higher homicide rate than when I first got here. So, but that, and Simon was a journalist. He worked at the Baltimore Sun. And he made the series The Wire, which was incredibly popular on HBO. So that's where my guilty pleasures really began, with Homicide.
Okay.
And by the way, my boss, that's her specialty, is homicide.
Oh yeah, I knew that.
Yeah, so I have to be careful what I say, because she knows way more than I do.
Yeah.
Thank you for talking to us today, Dr. Bulla. We've had a lot of fun and we learned a lot. And yeah, listen to our next episode. Aaron, do you have anything to say?
Nope. Bye.
All right, thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Of course.